They found her barefoot at the gates of Thorn Peak Citadel. Her lips were blue. Her arms were locked around the body of a dying wolf 3 times her size. Snow caked her lashes so thick she couldn't blink. Blood not hers soaked her threadbare shift from collarbone to hem, freezing into a shell of dark ice against her skin. The sentries raised their crossbows. Wolfless filth, one of them spat, but the words died in his throat. Because the wolf in her arms cracked one golden eye open and growled. A sound that made every soldier drop to one knee. A sound that carried the weight of absolute authority even through the rattling breath of a creature minutes from death. Because the wolf she had carried 6 miles through the worst blizzard in 40 years barefoot and bleeding and half-frozen herself was Crown Prince Callum Ironhart, firstborn son of the Lycan King. Ashlyn Ravencroft had not shifted in 22 years of breathing, and the Silverstone pack reminded her of it every single day. She lived in the crawl space beneath the packhouse kitchen, a damp rectangle of earth and old stone where the heat from the ovens above kept her from freezing in winter and slowly cooked her alive in summer. The ceiling was so low she couldn't stand upright. 4 feet of suffocating darkness that smelled of ash and mildew and the accumulated rot of 2 decades spent invisible. Her bedding was a horse blanket folded twice. Rough wool that abraded her skin raw but was better than sleeping directly on the frozen ground. Her possessions fit inside a tin box the size of a loaf of bread, a comb missing 4 teeth, a stub of candle burned down to a nub of wax, a spool of black thread, and a wolf-bone lantern carved from a deer's shoulder blade, the only thing her mother had left behind before the pack drove her out for birthing a wolfless daughter. The bone lantern was ugly. Its surface was scarred with clumsy knife strokes that might have been flowers, or might have been nothing at all. When Ashlyn held a candle inside it, the light that filtered through the thin bone cast trembling patterns on the crawlspace walls. Shapes that looked almost like running wolves if she squinted. She never squinted. Hope was a luxury taxed out of her long ago. This morning, the morning everything changed, Ashlyn was on her knees scrubbing the pack. House porch in the dark hour before dawn. Her fingers were cracked and bleeding. The December air bit through her dress like teeth. She could hear the ranked wolves inside laughing over breakfast, the clink of forks against ceramic. The rich smell of bacon fat and coffee drifting through the cracked window above her head, making her stomach clench with a hunger so familiar it had become part of her baseline existence. Alpha Warwick Stone's voice boomed from the dining hall. The Crown Prince hunting party passes through our territory today. I want every wolf in formal rank along the eastern ridge by noon. Full shift, no exceptions. A pause, and then the words that defined her life. And get that wolfless creature out of sight. I won't have the royal delegation thinking we breed defectives. Ashlyn's hands stilled on the brush. She had heard the rumors. Prince Callum Ironhart, eldest son of the Lycan King, was leading a winter hunt through the northern provinces. A diplomatic circuit, some said. A search for his fated mate, others whispered. Either way, it had nothing to do with her. Nothing ever did. Beta Cassius Cain found her before she finished the porch. He was a thick-necked man who smelled perpetually of pipe smoke and cruelty, a combination that made Ashlyn's throat close every time he came near. Cellar, he said, pointing toward the stone steps that led below ground. You stay down there until the royals pass. Alpha's orders. I have kitchen duties at... His eyes flashed amber. Not quite an alpha command, but close enough to make her stomach clench. If I catch your scent above ground before sundown, I'll put you in the ice shed for a week. Ashlyn gathered her brush and bucket without another word. She descended the stone steps into the dry goods cellar, pulled the heavy door shut behind her, and sat on a sack of flour in absolute darkness. She pressed one hand against the tin box in her apron pocket. The bone lantern was inside wrapped in a rag, and she listened to the muffled sounds of the pack preparing for a prince she would never see. 6 hours she sat there. She counted the minutes by her own heartbeat, the only clock a wolfless girl was permitted. The flour sack beneath her smelled of weevils and old grain. A spider built a web in the corner above her head. She could hear it, the impossibly faint vibration of silk being drawn from spinnerets. A sound no wolf would have bothered to notice because wolves had better things to listen for. But Ashlyn had learned to fill silence with whatever small sounds the world offered, because the alternative was listening to the voice in her own head that whispered endlessly that she was nothing, that she would always be nothing, that the crawl space was all she deserved and more than she had earned. Somewhere above, wolves howled in greeting, deep formal tones reserved for royalty. She imagined the procession, massive wolves in silver and black pelts banners snapping in the wind, the prince at their center, golden-eyed and untouchable. She imagined the ranked wolves of her pack standing tall and proud on the ridge, their fur groomed, their posture immaculate, performing the version of Silverstone that Alpha Warwick wanted the royals to see. The version that did not include crawl spaces, or birth debts, or girls who scrubbed floors before dawn and ate the scraps that even the Omega pups refused. Then the screaming started. It tore through the stone floor like a blade. Not howls, human screams, ragged and terrified. The crash of glass, a sound she had heard only once before the night a rogue wolf had breached the pack house perimeter when she was 9. The wet, concussive thud of a body hitting a wall hard enough to break. Ashlyn pressed herself against the cellar wall, hard hammering. The bone lantern vibrated faintly against her hip as though responding to the violence above. More screams, or a roar. Not a wolf's roar, something deeper. Something that rattled dust from the ceiling joists and made the glass jars on the shelves ring like bells. Then silence. A silence so complete it had texture. Thick and cold and absolute. She waited 5 minutes. 10. No one came to release her. No footsteps, no voices, no commands. The pack house above was still as a held breath. Ashlyn lit her candle stub, placed it inside the bone lantern, and climbed the cellar stairs. The pack house was empty, not just quiet, abandoned. Chairs overturned, breakfast plates shattered on the floor yoke, and ceramic shards mixing in pools of spilled coffee. The back door hung open, and through it, Ashlyn could see boot prints and paw prints churning the snow in every direction. A chaos of tracks leading toward the eastern tree line. She stepped onto the porch. The cold hit her like a wall. The sky had gone the color of old pewter, and the wind carried the sharp mineral scent of a storm gathering its strength. But under the wind, under the smell of ozone and pine, there was something else, something metallic and thick that coated the back of her throat. Blood, a tremendous amount of it. Ashlyn followed the scent without thinking. It was not a wolf's instinct, she had no wolf, but it was something older, something coded into the marrow of every creature that had ever been prey. She needed to understand the danger before it found her. The trail led her past the woodshed, past the smokehouse, and into the birch grove that bordered the eastern boundary. The snow here was trampled into mud and crimson slush. Tufts of fur, silver and gray and tawny, clung to the bark of shattered trees. She saw claw marks gouged into a boulder. 4 parallel lines, each as deep as her finger. Then she saw the wolf. It lay in a shallow depression between 2 fallen birches. A massive creature, easily the largest wolf she had ever seen. Its pelt was the deep charcoal of thunderclouds shot through with veins of silver that caught the fading light like metal thread. One of its hind legs was twisted at a wrong angle. Its flank rose and fell in shallow, labored hitches, and from a wound beneath its shoulder, a dark substance oozed. Not red like normal blood, black, iridescent, smelling of copper and something acrid that burned her nostrils. Poison. She recognized the smell from the herbalist stores. Wolfsbane concentrate, the kind that could kill a shifted wolf in hours. The wound itself was ugly, a ragged puncture that wept dark fluid in sluggish pulses timed to the creature's heartbeat. Around its edges, the fur had turned brittle and white, as though the poison was leaching color from everything it touched. The wolf's golden eyes fixed on her. A growl began in its chest, low and automatic, but it faded almost immediately into a sound that was closer to a whimper. Intelligence lived in those eyes. A sharp, furious, terrified intelligence that told her this was no wild animal. Easy, Ashlyn whispered, crouching. Her hands trembled, but she forced them steady. Easy. I'm not going to hurt you. The wolf blinked, its nostrils flared, reading her scent, and she saw the moment confusion replaced aggression. She smelled like nothing. No wolf, no pack bond, no rank pheromones. To a shifted wolf's senses, she was barely there, a ghost wrapped in human skin. She inched closer. The black ooze from its wound had spread across the snow in a halo of contamination, killing the grass beneath it. Wolfsbane. Someone had coated a blade with concentrated wolfsbane and buried it in this wolf's side. You're the prince, she said quietly. It was not a question. The sheer size, the silver threading, the golden eyes that every child in the kingdom learned to recognize from the moment they could understand the concept of royalty. This was Crown Prince Callum Ironhart, poisoned and abandoned in Silverstone territory. A sound rose on the wind, distant howls, not from her pack, deeper, colder, hunting howls. Whoever had done this was coming back. Ashlyn looked at the tree line. The pack house was 2 miles behind her. The nearest settlement, Thornpeak Citadel, the royal garrison, was 6 miles north across open tundra. The blizzard was 20 minutes out, maybe less. She was barefoot, dressed in a kitchen shift, and she carried nothing but a bone lantern and a tin box of useless trinkets. The wolf watched her calculate. Another whimper escaped its throat. She could see the poison working. The silver veins in its fur were darkening, the light behind its eyes dimming by degrees. "This is going to hurt," Ashlyn told him. She did not know why she said it. A warning implied care, and care implied a relationship. And she had no relationship with this wolf beyond the accident of geography that had placed them both in the same frozen birch grove at the same catastrophic moment. But her mother had always said that before doing something painful. Pulling a splinter, cleaning a wound, braiding hair too tight. And the words came out of Ashlyn's mouth like a reflex from a life she barely remembered. She knelt, worked her arms beneath his massive body, and lifted. He weighed more than she did, far more. Her knees buckled, her spine screamed, and the bones in her wrists ground together with a sound she felt more than heard. The wolf yelped, then went rigid with the effort of not biting her. She took one step, then another. The snow swallowed her feet to the ankle, then the shin. The wind was rising. North, she needed to go north. Ashlyn Ravencroft, wolfless, rankless, invisible, carried the poisoned Crown Prince into the storm. By the second mile, she had stopped feeling her feet. By the third, she had stopped feeling her hands. The wolf's body was a furnace of sick heat against her chest. Shifter metabolism burning through the poison, generating a fever that would either save him or cook his organs from the inside out. His blood soaked through her dress and froze against her skin in a shell of dark ice. Every breath she took was a knife of cold air that sliced her lungs into thinner and thinner ribbons. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel. The world reduced itself to the weight in her arms and the snow beneath her feet and the relentless arithmetic of survival. The blizzard hit at mile 2.5. One moment the world was gray and still. The next it was a screaming white void that erased the sky, the ground, and every landmark she had been using to navigate. Snow drove into her face horizontally, finding her eyes, her ears the gap between her collar and her throat. She could not see her own hands. She could not see the wolf she was carrying. White noise and motion. Nothing else existed. One step, one breath, one heartbeat. Repeat. Her mistake came at mile 4. She stepped onto what she thought was solid ground, and the snow gave way beneath her. A hidden creek bed masked by drifts. She plunged to her waist in ice water so cold it felt like fire. The wolf slid from her arms and hit the frozen bank with a sound that would live in her nightmares for years. A crack, a yelp cut short, and then nothing. "No!" She gasped, scrabbling at the bank. Her fingers were blue and useless. She could not grip. The current, sluggish but insistent, tugged at her dress, trying to drag her downstream. No, no, no. She found him by touch, half submerged, his massive head lolling in the shallows. His eyes were closed. His breathing had changed. Faster, shallower, the panting of an animal whose systems were failing. The fall had driven the poison blade deeper. She could feel the hilt protruding from his flank, now slick with frozen blood. Pull it out or leave it in. She did not know. She was not a healer. She was a wolfless girl who scrubbed floors and slept in a crawl space. She had no training, no instinct, no inner wolf to guide her. She was making decisions that might kill a prince and start a war, and she was making them blind, numb, and half-drowned in a frozen creek. She pulled the blade. The wolf convulsed. His jaw snapped open, and his teeth, each one as long as her index finger, closed on her forearm. She screamed. The pain was volcanic, a white-hot eruption that obliterated the cold and the fear and left only a single crystalline thought. He is dying, and if I let go, he dies. She did not let go. The bite lasted 3 seconds. Then his jaw went slack and a sound rose from his throat. Not a growl, not a whimper, but something she had never heard a wolf make before. A keen, low and sustained, and so full of anguish that it made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. An apology, she realized. He was apologizing. "It's all right," she told him, though her arm was bleeding freely and the creek water was turning pink around her. "It's all right, we're going to move now." She pulled him from the creek. She wrapped her apron around the wound in his flank, tying it tight with numb fingers that could barely form a knot. She tucked the bone lantern miraculously still in her pocket, its candle long extinguished against his chest between his forelegs, because some irrational part of her believed it would keep him warm. Then she lifted him again. Her arms had gone past pain into a trembling numbness that felt like strength if she did not think about it too carefully. The blizzard raged. The world was white. She aimed herself north by memory and by the direction of the wind on her right cheek, and by a stubbornness so deep and old, it might have been the only inheritance her vanished mother had given her. Mile 5. Mile 5.5. The wolf's heartbeat against her chest grew fainter, a drum losing its rhythm. She could feel his body cooling, the fever surrendering to the blizzard's patient arithmetic. His breathing had become so shallow that she pressed her ear against his rib cage every 100 steps to confirm he was still alive. And each time the wait between breaths lasted a little longer. Her legs were failing. Not suddenly. They had been failing for miles. But the failure was accelerating now, her muscles consuming themselves for fuel they could not find. She stumbled, caught herself, stumbled again. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to put the wolf down, to curl into the snow, to let the cold take them both into a sleep that would feel at the end like warmth. She knew this. She had heard the stories. Freezing to death was supposed to be gentle. She refused it, not with courage. She did not feel courageous. With stubbornness. The same blind, irrational stubbornness that had kept her scrubbing floors in a pack that despised her, sleeping in a crawl space when any sane person would have run, carrying a bone lantern that produced no light in a life that produced no hope. She refused to die because dying required a decision, and she was too tired to decide anything except the next step. At some point, she began talking to him. Not words exactly, but a low, tuneless hum that vibrated in her sternum, a sound her body made without her permission, as though some part of her understood what another part refused to accept. That she was carrying a dying man through a storm, and the only thing between him and silence was her voice. The lights of Thorn Peak Citadel appeared at mile 6, dim orange smears in the white blindness barely distinguishable from hallucination. She walked toward them. She did not run. Running would mean admitting she might not make it. She made it. She collapsed at the gate, and the world went dark for a time she could not measure. When it returned, it came in pieces. The crackle of a fire, the sharp smell of medicinal herbs, the murmur of voices pitched too low for her damaged ears to separate into words. She was lying on something soft, softer than anything she had ever touched, and someone had wrapped her in so many blankets that she felt entombed. Carried him 6 miles. Impossible. Look at her. She weighs nothing. The poison was night bloom wolfsbane, military grade. Another hour, and who is she? That last voice silenced the others the way a stone silences water. It was deep and textured and carried the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. Not the borrowed dominance of an alpha like Warwick Stone, but the real thing, the bedrock kind that did not need volume to command obedience. Ashlyn opened her eyes. The room was stone-walled and torch-lit, a chamber in the Citadel's inner fortress. A fire blazed in a hearth large enough to stand in. Around her bed stood a ring of figures, soldiers, healers, advisors, all of them rigid with the particular tension of people in the presence of their sovereign. And at the foot of her bed, hands clasped behind his back, stood the Lycan King. King Theron Ironhart was not what she expected. The stories described a giant, a golden-maned terror who had united the fractured wolf territories through equal parts diplomacy and violence. The man before her was tall but lean. His hair was iron gray. His face was carved with the deep lines of a ruler who had spent 40 years making decisions that cost lives. His eyes were the same gold as the wolf she had carried. Callum's eyes, she realized. But in the king's face, they burned with a controlled fury that made the air in the room feel thin. "You are awake," the king said. "Your son, Ashlyn, managed." Her voice was a ruin. "Is he alive?" "Because of you." A pause. The healers extracted the remaining poison. "He is in human form and resting." She exhaled, a sound that might have been relief or might have been the last of her strength leaving her body. The blade was coated with night bloom wolfsbane, the king continued. A compound available only to military quartermasters in certain noble houses. The king's jaw tightened. "Which means my son was betrayed by someone with access to the crown's own armory." Ashlyn absorbed this in silence. Court politics, assassination. These were things that happened in a world so far above hers that they might as well be weather. "What is your name?" the king asked. "Ashlyn Ravencroft, from the Silverstone Pack." A murmur rippled through the room. She saw the advisors exchange glances, the kind of glance that carries information without words. She recognized the calculation in their eyes. Silverstone, a minor northern pack, unremarkable except for its strategic position along the mountain trade routes. "And wolfless," one of the advisors murmured. The word moved through the room like a cold draft, reshaping every face it touched. "You are wolfless," the king said. Not a question. "Yes. You have no rank, no bond, no shifted form." "No. And yet you carried a 260-pound wolf 6 miles through a Category 3 blizzard, barefoot, in a kitchen shift, with a wolfsbane wound on your arm that should have rendered you unconscious within the first mile." The king's eyes did not blink. Explain, Ashlyn thought about it. She thought about the cellar, the silence, the blood in the snow. She thought about the wolf's golden eyes and the way his growl had died when he smelled her, smelled the nothing of her, and decided she was not a threat. She thought about the bone lantern against his chest, trembling with her heartbeat. He was dying, she said. I was there. The king stared at her for a long time. Then something shifted in his face, not softening exactly, but a recalculation, as though she had answered a question he had not asked. The wolf who bit you, he said. My son. His bite carried venom from the wolfsbane in his blood. Our healers tell me the compound entered your system through the wound. In a normal wolf, it would suppress the shift for days. In a wolfless human, he stopped. What Ashlyn whispered. In a wolfless human, it should do nothing. The king reached into his coat and produced an object she recognized with a jolt of irrational terror. Her bone lantern. Someone had taken it from her while she slept. But you are not entirely wolfless, Ashlyn Ravencroft. Your wolf is there. It has always been there. It was sealed, bound by a blood hex so old and so crude that our healers are astonished you survived infancy. The room tilted. She gripped the edge of the bed. Someone cursed you before you could shift, the king said quietly. And the wolfsbane in my son's bite is even now dissolving that curse. The bone lantern in his hand trembled, and through its carved surface, a faint golden light began to glow. 3 days passed in the fortress like a fever dream. Ashlyn spent them in a fog of physical and psychological upheaval. The healers monitored her blood, her temperature, her reflexes, charting the wolfsbane's slow war against the hex in her system with the precision of cartographers mapping unknown territory. They drew vials of her blood every 6 hours, dark red turning to crimson, turning to something that shimmered faintly in certain light, as though her veins were learning to carry fire. She felt it, a stirring beneath her skin, like a second heartbeat, learning to synchronize with the first. Sometimes in the dead of night, alone in her chamber, with only the bone lantern's golden glow for company, she would press her palm flat against her sternum and feel both rhythms at once, her human heart. And something else, something that pulsed slower, deeper, with a power that made her teeth ache. At night, she dreamed of running on 4 legs through a forest she had never seen. Trees blurred past her in streaks of green and brown. The ground beneath her paws felt right in a way the ground had never felt right beneath her human feet. She ran, and the wind carried scents she had no name for. Pine and loam, and the sharp mineral tang of snow-fed streams. And underneath it all, a scent that pulled at something in her chest like a hook in flesh. She woke with her fingernails digging crescents into her palms and a howl trapped behind her teeth. The healers told her this was normal, that the wolf waking inside her was reaching for the surface the way a drowning swimmer reaches for air. They told her to be patient, that the transformation would come when her body was ready, that forcing it would only cause damage. But patience was a skill Ashlyn had never learned. 22 years in a crawl space taught you to hold still, to make yourself small to survive the next hour. It did not teach you patience. Patience required hope, and hope was the enemy of survival. On the second day, Prince Callum Ironhart walked into her chamber unannounced. He was tall, taller than she had imagined, though she had carried every inch of him through 6 miles of frozen hell. Dark hair that fell to his collar in waves that suggested he had not bothered with a mirror in days, and a scar pale and raised running along his jaw from ear to chin. The poison had burned through even his accelerated healing, leaving a mark that would never fully fade. His golden eyes held the same fierce intelligence she had seen in the wolf's gaze, but softened now with something she could not name, something that made her chest tight and her breath shallow. You saved my life, he said. His voice was quieter than she expected, rougher, as though he had screamed himself hoarse and was still learning how to speak again. You bit me, she replied. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. I did. And I am sorrier for that than I know how to say. He looked at the bandage on her forearm. The healers had wrapped it in clean linen that morning, but already a faint stain was seeping through. Though the healers tell me it may be the luckiest bite in the history of the kingdom. They talked for an hour, then 2. He told her about the hunt, how his party had been ambushed at the border of Silverstone territory, how the attackers had known the exact route, the exact timing. Someone inside the royal delegation had fed information to the enemy. The precision of the assault suggested weeks of planning, months maybe. The other wolves in his guard had been scattered by a coordinated attack. Flashbang charges and oil slicks and carefully placed caltrops that shredded paws and sent massive wolves tumbling into ravines. He had been singled out, separated from his guard by a line of fire that appeared from nowhere. And then the arrow. Wolfsbane coated, military grade, fired from a compound bow at close range by someone who knew exactly where to aim for maximum venom dispersal and minimum immediate fatality. They had wanted him to die slowly, to suffer, to be found days later as a rotting carcass that would send a message to his father. "In your pack," he said, his voice careful. "Where were they? I don't know. They locked me in the cellars so the royal party wouldn't see me." Something dark moved behind his eyes, something that made the temperature in the room drop by degrees. "They hid you. They always hide me." He did not respond immediately. When he did, his words were measured, as though he was choosing each one with the care of a man diffusing an explosive. "Ashlyn, the route my hunting party took through Silverstone territory. It was planned in coordination with Alpha Warwick Stone. He provided the maps. He guaranteed safe passage." She understood what he was saying before he finished. The realization was not a shock. It was a confirmation of something she had always known in the wordless, instinctive way that prey knows the scent of a predator. "He sold you out," she said flatly. "That is what we believe." The words sat between them like a blade on a table. She thought about Alpha Warwick, his booming voice, his performative authority, the way he spoke of tradition and law and the natural order of things, while his beta beat wolfless omegas in the woodshed where the screams would not carry to the packhouse. Why, she asked. That, Callum said, is what we intend to find out. On the third day, the gates of Thornpeak Citadel opened, and Alpha Warwick Stone rode through at the head of a column of 30 Silverstone wolves. Ashlyn watched from the window of her chamber. Warwick sat his horse like a man who had never entertained the possibility of being denied anything. His back was straight, his chin was high, his ceremonial armor gleamed in the weak winter sunlight with the kind of polish that required servants in leisure time. Beta Cassius Cain rode at his flank. Behind them in two rigid lines marched the ranked wolves of her pack. Every wolf who had ever called her defective. Every wolf who had watched her scrub their floors and sleep in their crawl space and never once intervened. Not because they were cruel necessarily, but because she was invisible. And you cannot intervene on behalf of something you do not see. Warwick demanded an audience with the king. He got one. Ashlyn was not invited to the council chamber, but Callum brought her anyway. Walking beside her through the stone corridors of the citadel, with a hand hovering at the small of her back, close enough to feel the warmth of his palm, but not touching. A gesture of protection so deliberate it was almost a declaration. The council chamber was a cavernous hall lined with ancestral banners. Ironhart, Stormclaw, Nightshade, Ashwood, the great houses of the kingdom stretching back 300 years. The king sat on a stone dais at the far end, his iron-gray hair catching the torchlight. Advisors flanked him on both sides. Soldiers lined the walls. And in the center of the floor, hands clasped behind his back, stood Alpha Warwick Stone. "Your Majesty," Warwick began, his voice boomed with practiced authority. The kind of voice that commanded packhouses and intimidated rivals and had never not once been told no. "I come to collect my pack member, the wolfless girl Ashlyn Ravencroft. She is bound to Silverstone by birth debt in pack law. I demand her return." Ashlyn felt every eye in the room shift to her. She kept her gaze on the floor. Her arm, the one Callum had bitten, throbbed with a slow, deep pulse. And beneath her skin, something stirred. "She is not property," Callum said from beside her. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a drawn blade. Warwick's smile was the kind that preceded cruelty. "With respect, Your Highness, she is exactly that. Pack law is clear. A wolfless member cannot claim autonomy. She belongs to the Alpha who feeds and houses her." "You housed her in a crawl space," Callum said, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Warwick blinked. The micro-expression that crossed his face surprised and calculation, then the smooth mask of a practiced politician, told Ashlyn everything she needed to know about how much the Alpha had expected his treatment of her to remain invisible. Wolfless complaints did not travel. Wolfless stories were not told. That was the architecture of the system. Not just cruelty, but the erasure of cruelty's evidence. "The girl exaggerates," Warwick said, smoothly recovering. "She was given appropriate accommodations for her station. Wolfless members have always..." Callum cut him off. His voice remained quiet. That was what made it terrifying. The quietness, the control, the suggestion that the volume he was not using existed somewhere behind his teeth. Waiting, appropriate accommodations, where she ate scraps, where she was beaten for imperfect work, where she was locked in cellars so that visiting royalty wouldn't notice the pack's shame. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes avalanches. Warwick's composure fractured, a hairline crack visible only in the tightening of his jaw and the slight widening of his nostrils. The wolfless have always been housed according to their status. It is tradition, it is law, it is over. The king spoke from his dais, and the words struck the chamber like a gavel. King Theron rose to his feet, and Ashlyn felt the shift in the room. Every wolf present lowered their head by instinct, their bodies responding to the sovereign aura before their minds could catch up. This was not borrowed authority. This was the real thing, forged over 40 years of rule and tempered in wars that had reshaped the boundaries of the kingdom. Alpha Warwick Stone, the king said, "You stand in my hall and speak of law while my intelligence council compiles evidence that you coordinated the ambush on my son's hunting party." The blood drained from Warwick's face. "That is a lie." The king gestured. An advisor stepped forward, carrying a leather folio. He opened it, and the rustle of papers was the only sound in the chamber. "Quartermaster records from your armory confirm the requisition of Night Bloom Wolfsbane 6 days before the attack. The compound was signed out under your personal seal." The advisor turned a page. "Communication intercepts between your beta and known dissidents in the eastern reaches have been verified by 3 independent sources. The encryption was amateur. We broke it in an afternoon." Another page. "And the route my son's party followed. The route you personally mapped. The route you guaranteed as safe passage through your territory. It led them into the kill zone of a prepared ambush. Caltrops positioned at choke points. Oil slicks at the base of the ridge. Archers positioned in trees along a 300-yard corridor." The king's voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness was a fury so controlled it made the air vibrate. "You are a traitor," he said, "and you will answer for it. I am—" And Alpha Warwick roared, and his shift began, bones cracking, shoulders splitting, his human form tearing apart to reveal the massive gray wolf beneath. It was a dominance display, the last resort of a cornered predator, an attempt to assert power through the one currency that had always worked before. The gray wolf landed on 4 paws, hackles raised, lips pulled back from teeth like knives. "No king strips an alpha of his pack," Warwick snarled, his voice distorted by the wolf's vocal cords but still comprehensible. "That is the old law, the blood law." He lunged, not at the king, not at Callum, at Ashlyn. Later, the witnesses would disagree about what happened next. Some said the prince shifted first, that Callum's wolf, dark as charcoal and threaded with silver, exploded from his human skin in a blur of fur and intercepted Warwick mid-leap, that the 2 wolves collided in midair with a sound like thunder. Others said the king moved, that his own shift was so fast it was like watching a man become a thunderbolt, that he crossed the distance between the dais and the chamber floor in a single bound and caught Warwick by the throat before the gray wolf's paws touched stone. But Ashlyn, who was at the center of it, remembered none of that. What she remembered was the feeling. It began in the arm Callum had bitten, a heat that was not pain, a pressure that was not weight. It radiated outward through her chest, her spine, her skull, igniting every nerve ending with a sensation she had no vocabulary for because she had never felt it before. It was like hearing music for the first time. It was like opening her eyes after a lifetime of darkness. Her wolf woke up. The shift took her without warning and without mercy. She heard her own bones breaking and reforming, felt her skin split and reseal, tasted copper and ozone and something else, something wild and electric and achingly ferociously alive. The pain was unlike anything she had imagined, but woven through it was a joy so immense it obliterated thought. She landed on 4 paws. The stone was cold beneath her pads. Her senses detonated, every smell in the chamber arriving at once like a choir hitting a chord. The metallic tang of drawn weapons, the salt of human sweat, the cedar and lightning scent that she somehow knew was Callum's before her conscious mind could process why. The chamber went silent. Even Warwick froze mid-lunge, because Ashlyn Ravencroft's wolf was white, not silver, not pale gray, white. The pure, luminous white of fresh snow under a full moon. The kind of white that hurt to look at directly. The kind of white that had not appeared in the Lycan bloodlines for 300 years. The color of the first Luna. The color of the wolf who had, according to legend, bonded the scattered packs into a single kingdom and given birth to the Ironhart dynasty. The bone lantern which she had tucked into her belt that morning, unable to leave it behind even for a council meeting, lay on the stone floor where it had fallen during her shift. But it was no longer dark. Light poured from its carved surface, golden and steady, illuminating the crude knife strokes on its face, and now transformed by light, The marks were unmistakable. Not flowers. Wolves, an entire pack of wolves running in an endless circle around the lantern's surface. Warwick's alpha command hit her like a physical blow. A pulse of dominance meant to force submission, to drive a subordinate wolf to the ground with the sheer weight of authority. It shattered against her like water against stone. She felt it hit, the full force of a ranked alpha's will, and felt it slide off her new pelt without leaving a mark. She was not his. She had never been his. The hex that had bound her wolf had been the only chain keeping her in his pack, and it was ash now. She looked across the chamber at Callum's wolf. Dark charcoal shot through with veins of silver. Larger than she was, but sharing the same lean architecture. Both wolves made for distance, not dominance. His golden eyes met hers, and a sound rose between them. Not a howl, not a growl, but a resonance. A vibration that had no origin and no end. A frequency that bypassed her ears entirely and struck directly at her sternum. The mate bond. She had read about it in stolen books. Had dismissed it as fairy tale biology. But she could feel it now. A thread of light and heat connecting her chest to his. Taut as a bowstring, singing. Warwick tried to run. He did not make it to the door. The trial lasted 3 days. Ashlyn did not attend all of it. Her body was adjusting to the shift. The first shift at 22 was medically unprecedented, and the healers insisted on monitoring her through each transformation, documenting the way her wolf form stabilized a little more with each change. Her wolf was lean, built for endurance rather than combat, with those unsettling white features that made hardened warriors look away and then look back unable to stop staring. Callum stayed with her through the worst of it, the muscle spasms, the bone aches, the disorienting flood of new senses that turned the world into an overwhelming symphony of smell and sound. He taught her how to filter, how to choose which sense to follow and which to let pass, how to distinguish a friend's heartbeat from a stranger's at 100 yards. It gets easier, he told her on the second night. She was shaking so badly she could not hold a cup. He wrapped his hand around hers, steadying the ceramic, and she felt the mate bond pulse between them like a shared heartbeat. Does the bond get easier too, she asked. No, he said, and smiled. That gets louder. The evidence against Warwick was overwhelming. The quartermaster's logs, the intercepted messages, the testimony of 3 Silverstone wolves who had broken under the king's interrogation. Not through violence, but through the quiet, devastating application of a sovereign alpha's gaze, which made lying not just difficult, but physically agonizing. Warwick had orchestrated the ambush to destabilize the Ironhart monarchy, positioning himself as a power broker in the resulting chaos. The poisoned blade had been crafted by his own Beta Cassius Cain, who had hunted rare nightbloom wolfsbane from the southern swamps specifically for the task. The plan had been elegant in its cruelty. Kill the Crown Prince slowly. Let the king find his son's body days later, rotted and unrecognizable. Let the grief and rage fracture the kingdom's unity, and in the chaos position, Silverstone as a neutral mediator. A trusted voice, a pack that could be relied upon to hold the northern territories together. It would have worked, if not for a wolfless girl who had been locked in a cellar at exactly the right moment to find a dying prince in exactly the right place. On the 3rd day of the trial, Warwick Stone was stripped of his rank, his title, and his pack bond. The punishment was called the severing. Ashlyn had only ever heard of it in cautionary tales told to pups. Stories meant to terrify children into obedience, by describing the ultimate consequence of betraying one's pack. She watched from the gallery as the king's enforcer performed the ritual. A hand on Warwick's chest, a pulse of alpha authority so concentrated it was visible as a shimmer in the air, like heat rising from summer pavement, and then disconnection. Warwick screamed. It was not the scream of a powerful alpha, it was the scream of a man suddenly irrevocably alone, cut off from every pack bond, every wolf connection, every thread of belonging he had ever known. Wolfless. Warwick Stone was wolfless now. Ashlyn watched from the gallery, and she felt something that surprised her by how clearly she could catalog it. Pity. Not forgiveness, not mercy. Pity the way one pities a forest fire after the rain has drowned it. He had been cruel because cruelty was the only tool his pride permitted, and now his pride was a ruin. Silverstone was placed under royal stewardship. A new alpha would be appointed, one chosen by the pack members themselves under the king's oversight, a reform that sent shockwaves through the northern provinces. Several other packs with similar reputations for mistreatment of wolfless members suddenly discovered an urgent interest in updating their housing policies. Word spread through the provinces like wildfire. The Lycan King's future Luna had been wolfless. The girl who had saved the Crown Prince had been sleeping in a crawl space. The implications rippled outward in concentric circles of shame and reform. And Ashlyn, who had never intended to be a symbol of anything, found herself at the center of a political earthquake she barely understood. She spent hours in the Citadel's library, reading histories of Luna traditions, pack governance, the old bloodhex magic that had sealed her wolf. The librarian, an elderly she-wolf named Marin, who smelled of ink and dried lavender, brought her books without being asked, and left cups of tea on her reading table that were always exactly the right temperature. Small kindnesses. Ashlyn was learning to accept them without flinching, which was harder than she had expected. 22 years of survival had taught her that kindness was either a trap or a prelude to withdrawal. And the process of unlearning that lesson was slower and more painful than the shift itself. On the fourth day, the king summoned Ashlyn to his private study. The room was smaller than she expected. A stone chamber lined with bookshelves and smelling of old paper and cold tea. King Theron stood by the window looking out at the snow-covered courtyard where his soldiers trained in the thin winter light. "My son has asked me to approve a formal mate claim," the king said without preamble. "He wishes to name you Luna of the Ironhart line." Ashlyn's throat closed. Luna, the title that meant mate of the sovereign heir. Partner, equal, co-ruler. A title that had never in the entire history of the kingdom been held by someone who had been wolfless. "I know what you are thinking," the king said, turning to face her. "You are thinking that you are unqualified, that you are a kitchen girl with a bone lantern and a wolf that is 4 days old, that the court will reject you, that the traditionalists will revolt, that you will spend your life proving you deserve a title you never asked for." He paused. "You are right about all of it." She stared at him. "But my son is alive because a barefoot girl with no wolf and no rank and no reason to care about the crown decided that a dying stranger was worth 6 miles of blizzard." His golden eyes, Callum's eyes, held hers. "I have ruled for 40 years, Ashlyn Ravencroft. I have never met a single applicant for Luna who came with better qualifications than that." He placed the bone lantern on the desk between them. Its light filled the room. Winter released its grip on the northern provinces slowly, reluctantly, like a miser counting coins. January bled into February. February thawed into March. The snow that had buried the birch groves and choked the mountain passes began its long retreat. First in patches, sun-warmed clearings where the ground showed through in irregular circles of brown and green. Then in earnest, rivers shaking off their ice and beginning to sing again, the air losing its knife edge and softening into something that no longer hurt to breathe. Ashlyn spent those months learning to be a wolf. The transformations came easier with practice, though they never stopped hurting. The healers said that was normal for a late shift, that her bones had fused into their human configuration for 22 years and were not accustomed to breaking and reforming on command. That the pain would diminish over time but might never fully disappear. She learned to accept it. Pain with purpose was different than pain without it. Pain in the crawl space had been punishment for the crime of existing. Pain in the shift was the price of becoming. Callum taught her to hunt, not for food. The Citadel kitchens provided more than enough, and the idea of killing for survival felt distant and theoretical when you slept in chambers with silk sheets and fires that never went out. But hunting was about more than food. It was about reading the forest, learning to move through the world as a wolf moved, silent and sure and utterly present. They ran the northern ridges in the hour before dawn, when the light was soft and the world was quiet. Callum's charcoal form moving through the trees like smoke. Ashlyn's white wolf following, learning the rhythm of 4 legs, the balance of a body built along different lines than the one she had worn for 2 decades. He showed her how to scent mark territory, how to read the signs other wolves left behind, how to distinguish between a lone traveler passing through and a scout surveying for weaknesses. Skills that seemed archaic in an age of written treaties and diplomatic envoys, but skills that were coded into wolf DNA nonetheless. Instincts that transcended politics. The mate bond grew stronger. Not louder exactly, though Callum had been right about that too, but deeper, more constant, a presence in her chest that never went away. In human form, it manifested as an awareness of his location. She could be 3 floors away in the library, buried in a text about the first Luna's reign, and know the exact moment Callum entered the Citadel. Could feel the direction he was moving. Could sense his emotional state in broad strokes. Calm, agitated, amused, angry. In wolf form, it was overwhelming. A symphony of sensation that bypassed thought entirely and struck directly at her hindbrain. His scent became a compass. His heartbeat became a drum she could follow through miles of forest. And when they ran together, their strides synchronized without conscious effort. Two wolves moving as one organism. Anticipating turns and leaps and stops with a coordination that looked choreographed but was simply the bond expressing itself through motion. She caught him watching her sometimes. In the training yard, in the Great Hall, in the library where she spent her afternoons reading everything she could find about Luna history and pack law and the responsibilities that came with a title she had not asked for but was learning to carry anyway. His golden eyes tracked her movements with an intensity that made her breath catch. Not possessive, not hungry, something else. Something that looked like wonder tempered with disbelief. As though he was still trying to reconcile the wolfless girl who had carried him through a blizzard with the white wolf who ran beside him through the northern forests. On a cold morning in late March, Briar Moss arrived at Thorn Peak Citadel. Ashlyn was in the armory when the messenger found her, testing the weight of different daggers under the watchful eye of the weapons master. Self-defense training was not optional for a future Luna. Callum had been gentle but firm about that. The attempt on his life had been coordinated and professional, and whoever had funded it was still out there, still dangerous, still motivated. "You have a visitor," the messenger said, "a she-wolf from Silverstone. She says her name is Briar Moss." Ashlyn's hand stilled on the dagger's hilt. She found Briar in one of the smaller receiving rooms, standing by the window with her shoulders hunched and her hands twisted together. 24 years old, brown hair pulled back in a braid that was coming undone at the edges, wearing traveling clothes that had seen better days and boots caked with mud from the road. Briar turned when Ashlyn entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Briar dropped to one knee. "Luna," she said, her voice was shaking. "I came to—" "Get up," Ashlyn said, "please. You don't need to kneel." Briar rose slowly. Her eyes were red, whether from crying or the cold or simple exhaustion, Ashlyn could not tell. "I came to tell you what happened," Briar said, "after the trial, after they took Alpha Warwick away." She spoke for 20 minutes, her words tumbling out in a rushed, uneven stream, about the chaos in Silverstone after Warwick's severing, about the ranked wolves who had fled rather than face royal investigation, about the lower-ranked wolves who had stayed, who had gathered in the pack house and voted for the first time in the pack's history on who should lead them. "They chose my cousin," Briar said, "a woman named Freya Moss. She's fair, she's strong, and the first thing she did was dismantle the crawl space beneath the kitchen." Ashlyn's breath caught. "She had it filled in with stone," Briar continued, "and she commissioned a plaque. It lists the names of every wolfless member who was housed there over the past 50 years. 23 names, including yours and your mother's." Briar reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. She held it out with both hands. "Freya asked me to bring you this. It's a formal apology, from Silverstone Pack to you, for what was done, for what was allowed, for the cruelty that became tradition and the tradition that became law." Ashlyn took the parchment. Her hands were steadier than she expected. She unfolded it, read the words written in careful script, signed by Freya Moss and countersigned by 37 pack members, names she recognized, wolves who had watched her scrub floors, wolves who had eaten the food she prepared and never once met her eyes. And at the bottom in handwriting, she did not recognize a single line. "We see you now. We are sorry it took so long." Ashlyn read it twice, then folded the parchment carefully and tucked it into her belt beside the bone lantern. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. "For bringing this." Briar nodded, then hesitated. "There's one more thing. The bread rolls. The honey. That was me. I wanted you to know, in case you thought I knew," Ashlyn said gently. "I always knew." Briar's eyes filled with tears. "I should have done more. I should have stood up. I should have—" "You did what you could," Ashlyn interrupted, "and it mattered. More than you know." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Briar smiled, small and shaky but real. "I'm staying for the ceremony," she said. "If that's all right. Freya gave me leave, and I want to be there. When you become Luna, I want to be one of the voices that howls for you." Ashlyn felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking, opening, like a door that had been locked for so long she had forgotten it was there. "I would like that," she said. The Luna ceremony was scheduled for the first week of April. Spring had arrived in earnest by then. The birch groves were in bloom, their branches heavy with catkins that released clouds of golden pollen in the afternoon breeze. The meadows around Thorn Peak Citadel had gone from brown to pale green to a deeper emerald that hurt to look at in direct sunlight. Rivers ran high and fast with snowmelt, and the air smelled of wet earth and new growth and possibility. Callum insisted on a small ceremony, 50 witnesses instead of the 500 that tradition demanded. The protocol ministers were horrified. The king, to their dismay, agreed with his son. She carried me through a blizzard, Callum said during one particularly tense planning session. She transformed in front of the entire court. She is the first white wolf in 3 centuries. If the kingdom needs more spectacle than that, they are watching the wrong ceremony. The king had smiled, a rare expression that softened the hard lines of his face and made him look for a moment like the man he might have been before 40 years of rule had carved him into something sharper. My son makes a fair point, King Theron said. And that was the end of the discussion. They chose a forest clearing 3 miles north of the citadel, a natural amphitheater ringed by ancient pines where the ground was soft with moss and the canopy overhead filtered the light into something golden and dreamlike. Ashlyn walked the site a week before the ceremony, alone except for the bone lantern at her hip and the wolf stirring restlessly beneath her skin. The clearing felt right in a way she could not articulate. Sacred, maybe, though she had never been particularly religious. But there was a quality to the silence here, a weight, as though the trees themselves were paying attention. She thought about her mother, a woman she barely remembered, a face reduced to impressions, dark hair, gentle hands, a voice that had sung lullabies in a language Ashlyn no longer recognized. Her mother had carved the bone lantern, had etched the wolves into its surface with a crude knife in shaking hands, had given it to her daughter before disappearing into a world that did not forgive women who birthed defective children. Ashlyn wondered if her mother had known, if the hex had been placed before birth or after, if it had been meant as protection or punishment. The healers had theories. Ancient bloodline magic gone wrong, a rival pack's curse, a desperate attempt to hide a child with a wolf too powerful to control. They would never know for certain. The hex itself had been too crude to trace, the kind of magic that left no signature beyond the damage it inflicted. But standing in the clearing with the bone lantern warm against her hip and the spring wind stirring her hair, Ashlyn chose to believe it had been love. Clumsy and imperfect and ultimately insufficient, but love nonetheless. 2 days before the ceremony, the king summoned an emergency council. Ashlyn entered the chamber to find every major house representative present, and standing in the center flanked by royal guards was a man she did not recognize, thin, gray-haired, wearing the formal robes of a high counselor from the Eastern Territories. Counselor Davith Grimward, King Theron said. He has information regarding the conspiracy against my son. The old man's eyes found Ashlyn, studied her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She is the wolfless Omega, he said. Not a question. She is the future Luna Callum corrected. His voice carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. Grimward smiled, a politician's smile, empty of warmth. I come with a proposal from the Eastern houses. They are concerned about recent reforms, the dismantling of traditional pack structures, the elevation of wolfless members. This is not a negotiation, the king said. Is it not? Grimward produced a scroll, sealed with 7 different house crests. The Eastern Coltian represents 40% of the kingdom's military strength. They propose a compromise. Delay the Luna ceremony, allow time for the kingdom to adjust to such a radical change. He paused. Let the girl marry into a minor house. Preserve the Crown Prince's options for a more suitable match. The chamber erupted, advisors shouting, house representatives arguing. And through it all, Ashlyn stood perfectly still. She had spent 22 years being told she was unsuitable. She recognized the language of erasure when she heard it. Callum moved to her side. His hand found hers. The mate bond flared hot enough to make her gasp. No, he said, one word, but it silenced the room. King Theron rose from his throne, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees, Counselor Grimward, the king said. You stand in my hall and threaten civil war over the woman who saved the Crown Prince's life, who carries the white wolf, who the mate bond itself has chosen. He descended from the dais, each step deliberate, each step a promise. I have ruled for 40 years. I have crushed 3 rebellions and unified a fractured kingdom. And you believe that 7 minor houses and a coalition of frightened traditionalists can dictate terms to me? Grimward's composure cracked. Your Majesty, we only seek to preserve power structures that allowed a crawl space beneath a kitchen, that permitted the torture of wolfless members, that created the conditions for treason to flourish. The king stopped 3 feet from Grimward, and his eyes, golden like Callum's, burned with controlled fury. Here are my terms. The Luna ceremony proceeds as scheduled. The Eastern houses will attend, and they will bow. And if any house chooses rebellion over reform, I will personally strip every traitor of their rank and distribute their territories to packs who understand that tradition without justice is just cruelty with a longer history. Silence. Absolute. Do I make myself clear? Grimward swallowed. Crystal clear, Your Majesty. Good. The king gestured. Guards escorted the counselor from the chamber. When the doors closed, King Theron turned to Ashlyn. That was your fourth test, he said quietly. The first was the blizzard. The second was the shift. The third was accepting the title. And this was learning that being Luna means standing in rooms where men try to erase you and refusing to disappear. She met his eyes. Did I pass? The corner of his mouth twitched. You did not flinch. That is passing with honors. The night before the ceremony, Callum found her on the citadel walls. She was sitting on the battlements with her legs dangling over the edge, watching the sun set over the mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of orange and pink and purple that looked too vivid to be real. He sat beside her without asking permission, their shoulders touching, the mate bond humming between them like a plucked string. Are you afraid? He asked. Yes, she said. Good. Fear means you understand what you're taking on. She turned to look at him, his profile sharp against the dying light, the scar along his jaw white and raised, a permanent reminder of the poison that had almost killed him and the bite that had saved her. I'm not afraid of the responsibility, she said. I'm afraid I'll forget where I came from, that I'll become someone who builds crawl spaces instead of dismantling them. Callum was quiet for a long moment. Then he took her hand, turned it over, traced the scars on her palm, old burns from kitchen work, cuts from scrub brushes and broken ceramic. You carry the evidence, he said quietly. Right here. You couldn't forget if you tried. The ceremony began at sunset. 50 witnesses gathered in the clearing, arranged in a loose circle around the center where Ashlyn and Callum would stand. Among them were King Theron and his advisors, the new Alpha Freya Moss of Silverstone with a delegation of 12 pack members, representatives from the major houses, Ironhart, Stormclaw, Nightshade. And standing at the edge of the circle, hands clasped in front of her, and tears already streaming down her face, Briar Moss. Ashlyn wore a simple dress, linen, the color of birch bark, practical enough to shift in without mourning the loss. The bone lantern hung from a leather cord at her hip. She carried nothing else. No crown, no ceremonial weapons, no jewelry beyond the lantern that had been her only possession for 22 years. Callum stood in the center of the clearing in his formal leathers, dark and silver like his wolf. His golden eyes tracked her approach with an intensity that made her breath catch. The king performed the ceremony himself. The words were in the old tongue, a language that predated the unified kingdom by centuries. Ashlyn did not understand all of it, but she understood enough. The pledge of protection, the vow of partnership, the promise to stand together against whatever darkness sought to break them. When the king asked for her oath, she spoke in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the clearing. I swear by the wolf that woke inside me, by the bond that binds me, by the blood I shed and the miles I walked. I will serve this kingdom with everything I am and everything I will become. The king turned to Callum, asked for his oath. Callum's response was shorter, but no less binding. I swear by the life she saved, by the mate I found, by the Luna who carried me when I could not carry myself. I am hers, and she is mine. The king nodded. Then he spoke the final words, the ones that made it official. By the authority vested in me as king of the Lycan territories, by the old laws and the new, I name Ashlyn Ravencroft Luna of the Ironhart line, mate to Crown Prince Callum Ironhart, and future queen of this kingdom. Shift, he said, and let the kingdom see what we have seen. Ashlyn stepped back, began to remove her dress. The shift was easier now, after months of practice. The pain was still there, but familiar, almost welcome. She welcomed it. Let it wash through her. Let her bones break and reform. Let her skin split and reseal. And when she opened her eyes, the world had changed. Sharper, brighter, more alive. Her white wolf stood in the center of the clearing, and the assembled witnesses went silent, not with shock this time. They had all seen her shift before, but with a hush that falls over a crowd witnessing something they will tell their children about. A moment that transcends the personal and becomes legend. Callum shifted beside her, his charcoal wolf pressing his forehead against hers. The mate bond sang between them, not loud, not dramatic, but clear, like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. And then Briar Moss howled. A sound of pure, uncompromised joy that started low in her chest and rose into the evening air. Other voices joined her. First one, then three, then a dozen. until the entire clearing rang with the sound of wolves honoring their Luna. The sound rolled across the forest, echoed off the mountains. And for a moment, standing in the center of it, with Callum's wolf beside her and the bone lantern's light spilling across the moss-covered ground, Ashlyn felt something she had spent 22 years believing was not meant for her: belonging. The weeks after the ceremony passed in a blur of administrative work and diplomatic meetings and the thousand small tasks that came with preparing to be queen. Ashlyn attended council sessions, learned the names and histories of the major houses, studied trade routes and tax policies, and the delicate balance of power that kept the kingdom from fracturing into warring territories. She hated most of it, not because it was difficult, but because it required sitting in stone rooms with men who smiled to her face and whispered behind her back, men who called her Luna in council and wolfless in private, men who saw her white wolf as a political tool rather than a living thing. But she learned, because learning was survival. And survival was what she knew how to do. Callum helped where he could, translating the unspoken rules of court politics, explaining which advisors could be trusted and which ones served their own interests above the crown's, teaching her how to read the room, how to identify alliances and rivalries by nothing more than where people stood and who they spoke to and how long they waited before responding to a question. The king helped too. In his own way, he did not coddle her, did not soften the harsh realities of rule, or pretend that being Luna would be anything other than brutally difficult. But he treated her as an equal, asked her opinion in council meetings, listened when she spoke. And on the rare occasions when she made a suggestion that contradicted his own thinking, he considered it seriously rather than dismissing it out of hand. "You are not wrong," he told her after one particularly contentious session about reforming pack housing standards. "But you are thinking like someone who remembers what it is to be powerless. The men in that room have never been powerless. They do not understand why anyone would choose reform over tradition." "So how do I make them understand?" Ashlyn asked. "You don't," the king said. "You simply move forward, and eventually they either follow or get left behind." On a warm afternoon in late April, Ashlyn returned to the birch grove where she had found Callum dying. She went alone, needed to. The place had become something of a pilgrimage site in the months since the trial. Wolves from across the kingdom traveling to see the spot where the future Luna had saved the crown prince, where the white wolf had emerged for the first time in 300 years. But today the grove was empty, just Ashlyn and the trees and the memory of blood in the snow. The birches were in bloom now, their branches heavy with catkins that released golden pollen with every gust of wind. If you looked closely at the largest birch, the one between the two fallen trunks, you could still see dark stains in the bark, places where Callum's poisoned blood had soaked into the wood. New growth was slowly covering them, but they were there. Some marks do not disappear. They just become part of the landscape. Ashlyn stood at the edge of the depression where she had found him, remembered the weight of him in her arms, the sound of his labored breathing, the black ooze of wolfsbane spreading across the snow. She remembered the choice, the moment of decision, to lift him or leave him, to carry him or save herself. It had not felt like courage at the time. It had felt like the only option, because leaving him meant being alone in the cellar again, meant returning to a life where she was invisible. And even dying in a blizzard seemed preferable to that. But standing here now, months later, with the spring sun warm on her face and the bone lantern pulsing gently at her hip, she understood something she had not understood then. It had not been about him, not entirely. It had been about her, about refusing to be the girl in the crawl space one moment longer, about choosing action over invisibility even if the action killed her. She had saved herself by saving him. She heard footsteps behind her, turned to find Callum emerging from the trees, still in human form, dressed simply, no formal leathers, no ceremonial armor, just the man beneath the title. "I thought I might find you here," he said. She smiled. The bond, the bond. He came to stand beside her, looking at the same tree, the same stains. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found me?" he asked. "Every day," she said. And I think I would have died in that cellar eventually. Not from starvation or cold, just from becoming so small I forgot how to exist." She turned to face him, took his hand. "You gave me a reason to become large again." Callum pulled her close, pressed his forehead against hers. The mate bond hummed between them, steady and sure. "We gave each other reasons," he said. They stood like that for a long time. Two people who had saved each other in the same frozen moment, who had found in each other something neither had known they were looking for. When they finally shifted and ran back to the citadel, their paws struck the soft ground in perfect synchronization. Two wolves moving as one. The white wolf and the charcoal. the Luna and the Prince, and behind them their shadows stretched long and tangled and indistinguishable from each other in the late afternoon sun. That night, Ashlyn dreamed of her mother, not the fragmented impressions she usually carried, but a full memory, crystal clear and achingly vivid. Her mother kneeling in the crawl space, carving the bone lantern by candlelight, her hands shaking with exhaustion or fear, or both, whispering words in a language Ashlyn did not understand. Old words, magic words, and then her mother's voice, clear as a bell. When your wolf wakes little one, she will be stronger than they can imagine. Strong enough to break what I have built. Strong enough to become what I could not. The dream shifted, her mother standing, pressing the finished lantern into Ashlyn's small hands. The wolves will run in circles forever, her mother said, until you set them free. Ashlyn woke with tears on her face and the bone lantern glowing so brightly it lit the entire chamber. She sat up, held the lantern close, traced the carved wolves with her fingertips. Understanding now. Finally, the hex had not been placed by an enemy. It had been placed by her mother. A desperate woman trying to hide a child whose wolf was too powerful, too rare, too dangerous to exist in a world that killed what it feared. Her mother had sealed the white wolf away, had given up her own freedom to keep her daughter safe, had carved a lantern full of wolves who ran in circles, trapped, unable to break free, until Ashlyn carried a dying prince through a blizzard and earned a bite that dissolved the curse, until Ashlyn set the wolves free. She held the lantern close, felt its warmth, its light, the love that had been waiting 22 years to be understood. Thank you, she whispered, to her mother, to the woman who had sacrificed everything, who had known somehow that her daughter would be strong enough to break free. The lantern pulsed once, bright as a star, and then settled into its steady golden glow. 6 months after the ceremony in the first week of October, when the leaves had begun to turn and the air had gained its autumn bite, Ashlyn received a letter. It arrived with the morning dispatches, sealed with the Silverstone crest. She opened it in the library where the light was good and Callum was reviewing trade agreements across the table. The handwriting was careful, almost childlike in its precision. Luna Ashlyn. The plaque is finished. We held the dedication ceremony yesterday. 43 pack members attended. We read each name aloud. When we reached yours, no one could speak for a full minute. Alpha Freya asked if you would visit, not as Luna, but as the girl who used to live beneath our kitchen. She wants you to see what we built where the crawl space used to be. A library, open to all pack members regardless of rank. We are calling it the Ravencroft Memorial Library. Your mother would be proud. Briar Ashlyn read it twice, then looked up to find Callum watching her. Good news, he asked. She folded the letter carefully. Would you mind if we took a trip north? 3 days later, they stood in what had been the pack house kitchen. The floor had been torn up, the crawl space filled with stone and sealed, and in its place someone had built a staircase, leading down, but not to darkness, to light. The library was small, maybe 20 feet square, but the walls were lined with shelves, and the shelves were filled with books. History, medicine, law, pack governance, everything a wolfless member would need to understand the world that had been kept from them. At the center of the room stood a stone plaque, 23 names carved in letters that would outlast the building itself. And at the top in larger script, they survived in darkness so we could build in light. Ashlyn's mother's name was there, second from the bottom, Marin Ravencroft, exiled 2004, status unknown. She traced the letters with her fingertips, then pulled the bone lantern from her belt, lit it with a candle from the library's reading table, and placed it on a small shelf that had been built into the plaque's base, a space clearly designed for exactly this purpose. The golden light filled the room, brighter than it should have been, bright enough to read by in every corner. Briar stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. She would want you to keep it, Briar whispered. Ashlyn shook her head. She would want it here, where it can do what it was always meant to do, light the way for people learning to see themselves. They stayed in Silverstone for 2 days. Ashlyn met with the new Alpha, toured the pack house, watched Omega pups training alongside ranked wolves in the yard where she used to scrub stones. On the second evening, Freya Moss pulled her aside. The eastern houses are still making noise, Freya said quietly. Counselor Grimward has been recruiting, promising power to any pack that refuses the reforms. Let them recruit, Ashlyn said. Every pack that joins him is a pack that outs themselves as preferring cruelty to justice. Makes the king's job easier. Freya smiled. You sound like a queen. I sound like someone who used to live in a crawl space and remembers exactly what tradition without oversight looks like. They left Silverstone at dawn, shifted at the tree line, and ran the 100 miles back to Thorn Peak as wolves. Not because it was faster, but because after 2 days in human form, navigating politics and memory, they both needed to remember what it felt like to move without thinking. The bond between them was a golden thread, visible in wolf form, a shimmer in the air that connected chest to chest like light made solid. When they finally reached the birch grove where it had all begun, they stopped. The trees were dressed in autumn colors now, red and orange and gold. The dark stains on the bark had faded, covered by new growth. The grove looked nothing like the frozen killing ground where Ashlyn had found a dying prince. It looked like a place where something had ended and something else had begun. Callum shifted first, stood naked in the dappled sunlight with his hand extended. She took it, shifted, let the white wolf retreat and the woman emerge. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Any of it?" She thought about the question, really thought. About the crawl space, the blizzard, the shift, the crown she had never asked for, and the responsibility that came with it. "No," she said, "I regret what was done to me, but I don't regret what I chose to do with it." They dressed in the clothes they had left cached in a hollow tree, walked back to the citadel, hand in hand, as the sun set behind the mountains. And that night when Ashlyn stood on the battlements looking out over the kingdom, she would one day rule. She felt her mother's presence like a hand on her shoulder. "You set them free," the wind seemed to whisper, "all of them." The bone lantern's light glowed steady in a library 100 miles north, guiding wolfless omegas to books that would teach them their own worth. And Ashlyn Ravencroft, who had been invisible for 22 years, stood visible and whole beneath a sky full of stars and knew that some kinds of light never go out. They just wait for someone brave enough to carry them through the dark.